Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. Today we're going to be doing a tutorial for my quilt pattern Night Sky, and it's using my fabric. This is the first fabric collection I designed in collaboration with QT Fabrics. It is a curated collection with them, and it is called Nocturne. And we've got this lovely owl, and we're going to be doing it in the alternate color right with the teal owl for the tutorial today. This tutorial is kind of a preview because the fabric and the pattern to go with it will not be available until January, but our pre-order deadline is October 11th, so that is coming up really soon. We've had this available for you guys to pre-order for quite some time, but we wanted to make sure to get a tutorial out and so you guys can see the finished quilt, and it is fabulous. I'm so excited with how this turned out and how it looks, so we'll show you some photos of that. But I'm going to show you how to do it so you guys can see that this is not challenging at all. We're going to do some half square triangles. We're going to be doing the triangles from squares. So if you watched our last tutorial on making 4 time flying geese, this is similar, except it's way easier because you're just doing one half square triangle at a time, and it's just as accurate. If you struggled before with doing half square triangles where you cut them apart first into triangles and then sew them together, this is so much easier. So you guys are going to love it. All right, so again, you can order Nocturne. We've got yardage available. We have quilt kits. This kit is available that you can pre-order. You can do bundles, you know, whatever you want. You can grab it, but pre-order because we just don't know how much you guys are going to want. This is my first time doing a fabric collection. We want to make sure everybody who feels like they need this in their life can get it before we put in our order. And we will order some extra, but you know, at that point, fabric is usually like a one and done type of thing. So when it's gone, it's going to be gone. So this is the best way to ensure you get it if you want it. So we're going to get started with this. If you have not seen our video on fussy cutting, go watch that. We'll put a link to it in the video description down below, and then also in the eye above, and we'll show you how to do that there. I used painter's tape in the first one. I used Post-its this time to be able to trim this out and get the owl dead center, but this trick is awesome for when you're fussy cutting to get everything perfectly in line there. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and sew my frames around, and we're going to get working with the teal version of that. All right, so we're going to get started just by sewing our top rectangles to our square, and then we're going to sew our sides in. We're just using a regular 1/4" stitch for that, so nothing fancy, but what I do is I sew these two at the same time, and then I press at the same time just to save a little bit of time when I'm making these. I don't typically pin these. You certainly could if you wanted to, but if you've cut accurately, everything should be fitting together really nicely here. So I just kind of get it started and go. Once I've sewed just a little bit, what I do is I grab my edges and put those corners together, and then I just make sure my edges are nice and lined up on the edge, and I just hold those corners together with a finger. And then when I get to the point where I can't hold it anymore because it's going to go under there, I just move my finger to the side, and that helps maintain that 1/4" stitch all the way through. All right, I'm going to sew it to the bottom as well. So I always press my seams open. When you press your seams to the side, it eats up just the teeniest little bit of fabric. And so if you have issues where your blocks are not turning out the right size, it could be because of that. And especially with one like this where we've got a lot of points, I want to make sure that everything is as true to size as possible. And it gives me a lot of possibilities when I quilt because you don't have any of those lumpy, bumpy bits that always hang up your needle. All right, so once I pressed it open from one side, I like to flip it around and give it a press from this side as well, just to get it really, really flat. All right, now we're going to sew our side strips on to create the center of our block. And now with this, what I like to do is when I flip them over, again, you could pin if you want to, but what I do is I sew with this strip on the bottom of my sewing machine. That way these seams aren't going to get caught up when they go over my plates, and there's just this little bump here, and sometimes you can flip your seams going the wrong way, and it just helps everything lay flatter, gives you less headaches when you're pressing, things like that. So make your job easier if you can. All right, again, I don't pin, I just line up that first corner and get started. And then once I'm about an inch or so in, I just take my edge corners, put those together, and then I will just kind of pull it taut. If there's any difference between the size of the strips, there shouldn't be much. And if there's a big difference, then you'd likely have cut something wrong or sewed too large of a seam for your 1/4 inch. So check that. But again, just switch your finger to the side so you can maintain that straight 1/4 inch seam all the way through. All right, now we have to do the other side. All right, now we've got to press these seams open as well. The one difference is we want to be careful that we are not pressing these seams going in the opposite direction, which means I do a lot of lifting and pressing. So instead of just gliding my iron across like I did the first time, I always lift that up and slide it. Now when I get to this stage, I like to use my aerosol mist sprayer. This is not a quilting tool, it is a hairstyling tool, but you can get them on Amazon or beauty supply shops. What it does is it turns any liquid into an aerosol mist, which means you don't get water droplets all over your fabric and get some spots super wet. And you can just sort of mist it, especially your seams, and then you're able to really get a very, very flat block just by pressing it from the front. This is what I do instead of using steam in my iron. I feel like, one, I don't want this iron to spit. Every iron that I've ever put water into eventually spits and gets gross stuff on your fabric. You don't want that. And then also I feel like steam can sometimes distort the size of the fabric, and we want things to be as accurate as possible, and that starts with accurately sized pieces. All right, so I am good with that, and we're gonna move on to our half square triangles. All right, so for this quilt, I am using the feather background, and I like to have them so that they're going the same direction. So the feathers are pointing down for both of these, and then there'll be some more cohesion when I put it together. So that's just one thing that I take the extra time to do. It's certainly something you don't have to do, but it is a directional fabric, and so it will look cooler if you can take a little extra time to match them all together like that. All right, so what we do with this is we're actually going to sew our half square triangles 2 at a time. And it's super accurate to do it this way because we are sewing on the bias anytime we do a triangle. So that is stretchier than when you're going on the sides like that. Or this one has a little bit of stretch to it. This one doesn't at all. This one has a lot. So we want to make sure that that doesn't stretch on you. So if you were to cut this apart first and then sew your 1/4 inch seam, you might end up getting a lot of stretch, and then it's going to have a hard time getting your triangle to come together correctly. But because we're leaving this intact first and then sewing it, because it's still attached to the other side, it stays a lot more stable, and you end up with better, more accurate not flying geese, we did that in the last video, half square triangles where your points are more likely to end up where they're supposed to be. So to do that, we're going to flip that over, and I'm going to draw a line from point to point, and I really want to draw straight into that point. So what I'm doing, I'm lining this up, and I'm using a friction gel pen here. This will go away with heat, and it's on the wrong side of the fabric. So you could use a pencil with a sharp tip if you wanted. What you wouldn't want to use is an ink pen because that could run. But what's important is that you are leaning the tip of your pen or your pencil in toward the ruler like that. So you are marking right up next to that ruler. If you were going straight down or to the side, I know that's exaggerated, but if you were just doing this, your pen is not going to mark in the same spot. And so then you might have one triangle that ends up slightly smaller than it's supposed to be and one that ends up larger. The other thing you really want to make sure you're doing is that you are going straight into those corners, because what we're going to do is, instead of sewing along the side like we normally would, is we're going to sew and pretend like this line is the edge of our fabric. And so we're going to stitch a scant 1/4 inch seam all the way down both sides of this. And that way, if you aren't perfectly to that corner, you might think in your brain, okay, I'll I'll just adjust when I get there, but most people that I see do this don't make that adjustment. And then again, you end up with one triangle that's too small and one that's too big. So we want to have accurate triangles. We want to have points that end up where they're supposed to be and make us happy with our finished project. So take the extra time, make sure you're going straight into the corners. All right, I'm going to do that with the other one, but essentially what we're going to do is we're just going to layer these guys right sides together, and then we're going to stitch all the way down one side, and then we're going to flip it around and stitch all the way down the other side. And I sew this with a scant 1/4 inch seam. To do that, I just set my sewing machine up to sew a 1/4 inch, and then I press a button and my needle moves one needle width to the right, and that gives me just a little bit extra wiggle room when it comes to trimming down, which is important because you always want to have a little bit extra instead of not enough. One more tip before we start sewing. I don't generally pin these because I've done thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of these. So I've got enough practice where I can do it with confidence. But if you were going to pin, you would not want to pin out here because that is not going to keep your points together. And that's what's important. You have to keep your points together or this is not going to turn out right. So what you want to do is you want to pin where you're going to sew, which is down both of those sides. So you would pin right at the top across your tip, and then you would line up your corners down here, and you would also pin at the bottom down here. And that way this corner has no chance of moving on you as you're sewing, whereas if you were to pin way out here, that's just really a waste of time because your corners can move significantly between when you pin it and when you get over to sewing. So when I am pinning, what I do is I just get it lined up right underneath, and then I remove my pin so I'm ready to go because the presser foot's going to hold everything in place. I've got my edge of my presser foot in line with that line that we drew, and we're just going to go ahead and start sewing. And I'm just going to be very careful to keep my presser foot in line with the line that we drew, just like we would if it were the edge of the fabric. You also want to make sure that you're not pulling or tugging on this. You wouldn't want to stretch that out of place. You just kind of want to hold it and let it come up. Now when you get to the bottom where you can no longer hold on to this bit anymore, you're going to remove your pin if you pinned. Then you're just going to move your finger to the side and guide that so that way you are sewing that accurate 1/4 inch seam all the way to the edge. When you do this, sometimes people end up with smiley faces or frowny faces for their seams instead of straight across. It's usually because you either haven't maintained your 1/4 inch stitch all the way through, or you have pulled on the fabric as you are doing it and you have stretched that bias out too much. All right, so if you were going to do it without pinning, what I do is I just grab it like this and I will line up my first 2 corners here, and I've got those right on top of each other. Then I'm just going to, and I highly recommend that you chain piece these, it goes so much faster, lift that up and start sewing. And then once I get to where I've got maybe a couple inches in, I will grab my edges and line those corners up, and then I just leave my finger right on top of that, and that holds them together until I get to a point where I have to move it to the side. All right, so you would keep doing that. You would chain piece all of your half square triangles together, well, squares at this point. Then you're just going to pull it out. You don't even have to cut your threads or anything, and you can just sort of pile everything over here. I do that all the time with mine. And now we're just going to sew down the other side. You always want to slow down when you come to your points because you want to, one, make sure that you are really accurate with that seam, and also you're probably going to want to reposition the next one. So if you're someone who likes to sew with the start-stop button on your machine instead of the presser foot, you don't want to do that for this one because you have to be able to control your speed. So I'm going to flip this over because I think you're going to be able to see a little better if we do that. You can see here that you've got my seam lines here. And I'm going to go ahead and measure that. It should be a 1/2 inch or ideally a little bit less with that scant 1/4 inch seam. So I'm just going to measure that, and I am just a smidge under. I'm not quite at 3/8 of an inch. I'm like halfway between 3/8 of an inch and 1/2 an inch, which is perfect because then I'm going to be able to trim that. Now what you don't want to have is less than 3/8 of an inch. Then you're probably not going to have a big enough seam allowance when you cut this apart. All right, so I'm lining up this ruler right on that line that we drew, and then I'm going to give it a cut. Now, if you are not perfectly on this line, that's not a big deal. But what you don't want to have is too skinny of a seam. If you end up with less than 1/8 of an inch of your seam allowance, and that's the distance from the sewn line to the edge of the fabric, you are going to have a compromised seam. You're going to have a hard time pressing it open. You're going to have it might pop open with use, or even just when you're loading it on the long arm to quilt, or your quilter if they're the ones doing it. So you do want to be careful when you're doing it. Don't get too crazy with it. But again, if you're off just a smidge, no big deal. Now we're going to press these open, and I didn't always used to press open. I used to press the side just like many people do, but the more I started quilting my own quilts, the more I realized that it's really a lot better to have super flat seams, because you can do a lot more things with them and you get much more beautiful points that just look fabulous than if you're pressing it from side to side. Like this is just so super flat. So I always will press from one half, or from the back side, and then from the front side as well with those. So now you can see that from those 2 squares, I now have 2 half square triangles. So I'm going to go ahead and press my other set open that I sewed up, and then I'm going to show you how to trim these, because we're not quite ready to sew them into the block just yet. So now it's time to give these a trim, and this may seem like an extra step that is not needed, but let me tell you, it is super critical. We're going to get rid of a little bit of fabric on this. It's going to make everything fit together fabulously. You'll get super flat points, and it will just be wonderful. So what you're going to do is you're going to line your 45-degree line up with that seam allowance. You want to make sure you've got a little bit of fabric hanging past the measurement that you want to trim to, as well as on the side, the right side and the left side that you're going to cut. If you're doing it as a lefty, you're going to be having the extra fabric on the left side. So what I do is I put my palm completely down. I see when people do this with their fingers, the ruler is much more likely to slide around on them, which is not good. We want it to stay put. So let me line that up again. All right, and I put my pinky to the side. That also helps give me a nice anchor to keep my ruler from slipping. So now I'm going to go ahead and trim on the right side and the top side. And again, if you're a lefty, you would be trimming your left side first. We're going to get these guys out of the way. All right, now I'm going to do a 180-degree flip. So now my cut sides that I just trimmed are on my left and my bottom. Now this time I'm going to start by lining up that 45-degree line. This is what is going to ensure that your points are in fact going to your points. And since we've trimmed this, I'm making sure that it is right on the measurement that I need to trim to. And then I line my hand back up, putting my palm down and my pinky to the side. The pinky to the side also helps keep your fingers out of the way of the rotary cutter, which if you know anyone who's ever sliced themselves, is a very good thing to keep out of the way. So now we have a half square triangle that is trimmed perfectly to size. You can see we didn't take that much off, but it's very important, especially when you put it next to this. You can see that there is a noticeable size difference. So if we didn't trim these down, and we didn't do that for all of them, you would end up with a ton of extra bulk, and you would have a hard time fitting your block together at the end. You would have a lumpy and bumpy quilt, and you would have a hard time getting your points where they belong. So don't skip this step. I know it takes a long time if you have a lot of them for a quilt, but you don't have to do it all at once, and you can definitely split it up and do one colorway at a time. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and trim these up, and then we're ready to put this block together. So I have my block all laid out. We can almost fit it all on our camera above, and the key here is pinning. We got to take our time to pin these guys to fit together correctly. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and flip these guys right sides together. Now when we sew this, we're going to sew from the top to the bottom. So I always pin in the right side or the lower side of the seam allowance. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to layer these up, and I always look at it from above like this, and I'm going to make sure that I've got those right on top of each other with that seam. And it's pretty easy to tell with a block like this because one side has a print and one side has that neutral, so you can see that you've got it right on top of each other. And then I pin right into that seam allowance, just like that. You could also pin down here. I typically skip that, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stitch, get my needle down in this half of the seam allowance, and then pull that pin. It's going to be just a tad bit different when we do the bottom one. I'm going to go ahead and flip these guys right sides together so you can see that. So in this case, our pin is going to go in this bottom half of the seam allowance because again, we're going to sew down here, and then we'll have our pin coming through here. So I'm going to go ahead again and look at that from above, get everything the way it should be, and then put my pin in here. So now for this one, we'll start up here and we'll sew down, and we're gonna stop with our needle down in this half of the seam allowance. That's gonna kind of act like a pin. That way we can sew on once we remove our pin. Now for these side ones, we're gonna flip them right sides together. Obviously, we're not gonna be going in two different directions there because we have two prints that are coming together, but the process is the same. You're gonna think, what half of the seam am I going to sew second? And that's where you're gonna put your pin. So I'm gonna go ahead and put that right here, and then I'm ready to go. Now, when I'm actually doing this, I don't pin everything together first and then go to the sewing machine. I pin as I go. So I would do this entire row, and then these guys, and I just put those pins in as I go and sew that way. So take your time doing this. You want to get those right on top of each other because that's what's going to make your points show up exactly where we want them when we sew our block together. One more tip before I get going. If you had trouble getting everything to size, there are a couple things that you can check. First, you want to make sure that you sewed that scant 1/4 inch seam and those seam allowances were a 1/2 inch or a little bit less than that. So between 3/8 of an inch or a 1/2 inch before you cut your triangles, half square triangles apart when we had them as squares. And you want to make sure you've cut correctly. You want to make sure you press correctly. If you didn't have a nice straight line here, if it kind of curled up on the edges, then you probably stretched something out while you were pressing or while you were sewing it together. So you want to be careful when you do the things like that. You want to make sure that you are trimming and that everything is going straight to the corners, that you have the seam is going right into the corner like that. If you have done all that and you've checked your measurements, you've checked your pressing, you know everything is going all right, but your fabric is still getting stretched and warped, then you need to check what fabric you're using and make sure you purchase it from a quilt shop. A lot of times if you purchase from a big box store, like a chain fabric store, it's not the same type of fabric quality. They cut corners on the thread count of it, and then also the finishing techniques that they use when they are setting the dye process. And both of those things makes the fabric not as stable when you're doing things like this. So it has more of a tendency to not keep its shape when you're doing more complicated piecing, like anything with triangles. So it's very important that you're working with fabric from a quilt shop and not from a chain store if accuracy is something that you really care about. We have a whole video on that. I'll link it in the description here and then also in the description down below. All right, so like I said before, I'm going to go ahead and put that underneath. I've got the pin in there. I'm going to sew a couple of stitches just to get that really set in there. I want to get as close to that pin as possible. And then go ahead and pull that out. And then what I do, I don't typically pin the bottom part. I just make sure my points are in line, hold my finger over that. And then make sure I sew that 1/4 inch seam. Now this is how I typically do it rather than pin it all ahead of time like I did when I was showing you the different ways to pin, is I will just grab it and do one entire row at a time. So, my tummy's growling. I just had lunch, so I'm not sure why it's growling. Anyway, so I'm gonna go ahead and grab it, I line it up, and I do a little pinning, and then I just feed it in and do that as I go. That way I only have to grab one pin as I'm working on it too. And get a lot done that way. I typically like to go down to the bottom row next. It doesn't matter. You know, you can do whatever order you want. This is just kind of how I've done it as I was going through. It kind of made sense in my brain. But as long as you get them all sewn together, you're fine. So when you're pressing here, you also want to make sure that you are not pressing any of these other seams going in a direction we don't want. So I always open that up with my fingers first, and then I keep 2 or 3 fingers down on the seam ahead of it, and then I do that lifting and pressing. And that keeps everything where it should be and makes it really easy to press open. And you can see we've got a really great join here, and it's because we took the time to press and pin it exactly in a great way. I'm gonna go ahead and give that another press from the right side, get it nice and flat. All right, so when we do this section, when we put our top 2 rows together, it's gonna be the same thing. We're just gonna fold that over right sides together and pin just like we did when we were sewing just the single squares together. That's no different. When you do this though, there is one thing that you wanna keep in mind. You can pin if you want. This should be the exact same width from the top to the bottom as long as you have paid attention. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna sew just to the right of where these little triangles come together. I'm gonna zoom in so you can see it a little better. So right here, you can see where there is a tiny little triangle that's formed of where these guys come together. So when you're stitching, you're gonna stitch down and you're going to stitch so that you are just 1 needle width to the right of where that teeny tiny little point is. And as long as you do that, then when you fold this open, your points are gonna be exactly where you want them to be and it will look fabulous. But the key is sewing with this on top and then paying attention to where that's at. If you have to juggle your 1/4 inch seam a little bit because it's not exactly a 1/4 inch from the edge, that's okay. Just do it gently, come in or come out, and then get back to your 1/4 inch stitch, because no one's gonna know if you're off a teeny bit on the inside, but they will be able to tell if you are off from the outside. So a couple inches or maybe like 1/2 inch there, and then I line up my points in the back and I just kind of pinch those together. And if I have to pull it taut, not tight, but just a little taut, and then I kind of put my finger on where those seams come together to keep everything nice and in line. And that saves you some time. That way you're not having to pin absolutely everything. All right, I'm slowing down quite a bit. I want to make sure I'm just to the 1 needle width to the side of where that little triangle is, and sew the rest of the way. Now to save a little bit of time, I'm gonna go ahead and put the other side on as well, and then I'll be able to press everything and get my final block together next. I can already see that these joints are really fabulous. We're gonna go ahead and press it and then we'll take a closer look. This is where pressing open really has some big payoffs, because if I were to press this to the side, you would end up with a big bulky seam, and you might also not have as sharp looking point as you would if you were to press it open. By doing it this way, everything is super flat and that makes your points look super pointy. All right, so you wanna make sure you're paying close attention to that bit right there. We're gonna do a little bit more to it when we get to the other side. Give a little spritz with the mister to help it get extra flat, because there is, you got a lot of seams coming in there. You gotta take a little bit extra care, but definitely make sure you are lifting and pressing as you go through here, because you don't want to accidentally press some of these seams going the wrong way. All right, so for this seam, you can see I've got some great joints here. We'll zoom into that in just a second. But what I want to do is take my mister and I'm going to spritz just the seam where that super pointy point is. And I'm gonna go over that with my iron, and that's gonna help flatten everything out, make that point as sharp as it can be, and we're gonna be good to go there. Now, if for any reason you weren't super happy with how this turned out, you don't have to rip out the whole thing. You can just rip out about 1/2 inch to 1 inch on either side and readjust and go back over that. Now that is a fabulous joint. I'm so excited about that. It looks so good. The one on the bottom also looks super fabulous, and it's because we just sewed just to the side of that. All right, I'm gonna press my upper rows as well, and then we'll finish this block. All right, now it's time to join our top and our bottom row to our center. Because of the way this block is constructed, it essentially would have been a 16 patch if this center wouldn't have been one big one, but we've already have a good half of it all together here. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and flip these guys right sides together, and again, I wanna make sure that I'm sewing with this section on top so that I can sew just 1 needle width to the right on the seam side of where that tiny little triangle is. Now, when I'm doing things like this, what I want to do is always look from the top. If you've been used to pressing seams to the side, you might be used to having things lock in place here. For here, you just have to look at it from the top, make sure that you are where you should be, and then always put that seam allowance in the side. Now for this one, we also have two triangles coming together here. So you're gonna line those up the same way you did when you were putting things together to sew your rows together, and then also just to join the half square triangles into sets of two. Now here you don't have to pin because there's nothing that we're joining that to, but you do want to pay attention to it when you are sewing. But again, you will have it for here and here as well. Now you could go through and sew all this and then come back and pin, but since there's no danger of accidentally stitching this part here when you are sewing in here, what I like to do is pin them both at the same time. So I'm going to flip those right sides together and then flip it around, because I always find it easier to pin when the edge I'm pinning is facing away from me. I'm going to go through that pinning process again, then I can sew down both sides. And actually what I did when I was completing this quilt was I got everything to the point of where it was ready to get pinned together, and I had them all stacked in order. So I basically got everything ready to the point where I had my center rows and my outside rows. They were all stacked in order, so but I had my perfectly arranged blocks all together, and then I pinned them all together just like this, and then I sewed them all at once. So it was very efficient. I was able to get done pretty quickly doing that. So that I found worked really well for me to be able to do this quilt quickly. So just like when we were sewing the half square triangles together, I'm just going to sew a couple of stitches in on this first one and then pull that needle or the pin out while the needle is kind of acting like a pin. Then you can go ahead and zoom through, but you want to make sure you stop when you hit the first half of that seam allowance with your needle down. If you have the option to just keep it down when you stop on your sewing machine, that's going to be ideal, because then you can remove your pin and nothing is going to move. Your points are going to look fabulous when you're done. Now at this point, what I do is I grasp you can see it over here, I grasp the next seam and then I just kind of hold it out. My extension table doesn't go with this sewing machine, so I just kind of hold it out, and then I sort of put my finger on where that join is halfway through. I'm going to slow down, make sure I'm sewing one needle width to the right, and then you do have a couple of seams underneath here, so you want to make sure that they don't get flipped going the wrong way when you go over your little throat plate there. So just keep an eye on that. Again, I'll stop with that needle down once I hit that seam allowance, and only then pull the pin. And for this one, I sew all the way into that again, then pull the pin, then I'm going to put my finger to the side to make sure I can maintain that 1/4 inch stitch all the way through. Now, if you're doing a bunch of blocks, you could just lift it up and chain stitch and do one entire side at a time. I just got the one here, so I'm going to go ahead and sew the other side now. So you want to be careful when you are pressing this open, because obviously we have a whole lot of seams here. We don't want to accidentally get them going the wrong direction. So go ahead and open that up with your fingertips, and then I always move to wherever the next join is and hold that down a little bit. That will help keep everything nice and flat, and as long as you keep the tip of your iron and you lift and press, you should be fine. Hold it a little bit for this last bit. Oops, got one going the wrong way, so we're gonna press that back. All right, I'm gonna do the other side, and then we're ready to do our final mist and just take a look at all the beautiful points. Now for this last mist, I'm gonna go ahead and not only get the 2 seams that we just pressed, but I'm gonna go ahead and mist the whole block real quick. And then I'm just gonna flatten this all out really good. I'll do the bottom half first so you can see the difference and why this is worth taking that extra step. All right, so first I'm just gonna hit that from the side. You wanna pay close attention at this point. I kind of put my finger on top of it, make sure everything is nice and flat before I put the iron on top. And then you don't want to kind of go like this. You're not ironing a shirt, but you just want to carefully move your iron around just to keep it nice and super flat as you're going. And you can see this bottom half is super, super flat. You can see the points really well. The joints really came together fabulously. This side could still use some work because we haven't pressed it yet. So I'm going to start again with that top seam and then work my way out. And man, does this look good. We have some fabulous joins. Our points are going straight to the corners and they are meeting exactly at the edge where they should be. They're coming together really well on the ends as well. You can see them matching really well on the corners, and you're supposed to have a 1/4 inch between where the point comes together and where the edge of your fabric is. That'll get caught up in your seam allowances when you do that. I'm just going to real quick show you how to pin these together with my other block so you can continue to have those fabulous joins as you sew this together. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip these guys right sides together, and then I'm going to show you my 2 pinning technique for getting these points absolutely perfect. All right, so get that flipped right sides together, and then I'm also going to turn it so that the side I'm pinning is up. All right, so we've been paying attention to these little points the entire time because they're very critical in having points turn out the way they should. So to do this, what you can do is you're going to put a pin in right at the tip, right in between where those 2 seams come together, just above where that little triangle is, where you would sew if you were sewing it together. And then you're going to find the same spot on the one below it, and you're going to put the pin in there. Now you're going to pinch this needle in between your thumb and forefinger so it's going straight up and down through the fabric. And with your second pin, you're going to take and put that through horizontally through where you are pinning. And what this does is this keeps it to make sure those points stay right on top of each other, because if I were to rock this and pin it, it would move the top fabric forward and the bottom fabric back, and then they would no longer be in alignment and your point just wouldn't look as good as it could otherwise. But by doing this, I'm able to keep them right where they should be. Now I see a lot of people sometimes will pin like going across or way over here, or sometimes their pin is not where you're going to be sewing. Like this would not do any good because we're going to be sewing right across where that join is, and this is not holding it together where you need it to be held in. So you really need to pin right where you're going to be sewing if you're going to have the best results. Now the rest of it, same process. You're going to do your double pinning technique for this one, and this one you're just going to line up your tops. You can take a look at it from above to line that up. And then you're just going to sew the same way we did before, where you are sewing just to the side, 1 needle width to the side where those tiny little points come together, and you will continue to have fabulous joins. I'll go ahead and do that and press it so you can just see what it looks like. So you can see how this can come together just absolutely perfect. Every single one of these triangles is just fabulous. And just so you don't think that I'm like, must be a machine, I'm going to show you one that isn't perfect, but I'm going to take it. I would not pick this out. This one here, it's off, it's perfect on this side, it's off just a smidge over here, and what you could do if that bothered you is just pick about 1 inch or so on either side, repin it and sew it again. You would want to start and stop a little bit before to make sure you lock those threads in, and then if you don't get it after that, I wouldn't redo it because, you know, too many times you can stretch the fabric out too much. But this is not something I would pick out because once it's all quilted and everything, you're not going to notice that this one was off just the teeniest little bit. It's not a big deal. I would be totally fine with that. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this tutorial for Night Sky featuring my fabric collection, Nocturne. It's a collaborative collection with QT Fabrics. Again, this tutorial is a preview because the pattern and the kit will be shipping out in January or February, depending on when the fabric arrives and how long it takes us to safely get it into kits and out to you guys, dealing with COVID restrictions. But our pre-order deadline for the kits and for the Nocturne fabric is October 11th. So if this is something that you want, or you like the fabric but you want to get a different kit or just have the yardage or a fabric bundle, you can order all of that on our website, shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. We highly encourage you to pre-order because we do not know how much of this we can potentially sell, how much you guys are going to want, because this is our first fabric collection. We have no data to go on from previous sales. So if you want it, please pre-order, and that is the only way to ensure that you get it. Again, we will order a little bit extra, but this is the best way. So go ahead and make that pre-order over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. We will have one more quilt to reveal to you as a kit. It was actually a pattern that we had previously done for Stashing with Stephanie that I think looks even better in this fabric than it did in the original. And that one is almost done. I was up till 2 a.m. trying to finish it, and I decided I need to sleep now. I'll figure that out later. So I'm gonna finish that guy up for you. This quilt was quilted by Shelly Moore, quilt stitching by Shelly. She did a fabulous job with it. She kind of mimicked the wood grain pattern that you see on some of the fabrics in here. These are Habit and our little bits on the sides kind of had that wood grain look, and I love what she does. She uses a computerized machine, so it's always perfect, but she has a real gift for picking patterns that really accentuate your quilt. And so even if you're doing an all over design, which is what this one was, it just sort of elevates it in a way that you normally would only get if you did custom quilting. So I love Shelly. That's probably a good plug for her. But anyway, if you like this fabric, shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. You can pre-order it. You can pre-order the quilt kit, and I think we'll have the pattern available for pre-order as well. That will be a paper pattern for now because we don't have the digital download available for you at this time. So check that out, and until next time, happy quilting.